in here praying, maybe he won't show up. How long do we have to wait before we can go home? We're getting ready to have an exam, as you may notice in your calendar. And the reason I'm late is because I was negotiating with some high schools because apparently they have a student's holiday on the day I want to have the exam, which is not unusual. They seem to plan carefully to screw up my schedule. I'm shooting for next Thursday, not this Thursday, next Thursday. That's what I put on my schedule, and I kind of like to stick to that. We may have to put it off to the next class after that. Don't plan on that. I mean, start getting ready for it. We'll see how that works out. I have to get a list of, come on, stupid thing, get in there. Okay. I have to get a list of keywords out to you and some other study notes to help you get ready for it.
So you're going to give us like a review sort of method?
Not exactly a review, but what I do is keywords. And if you know 2 things about every keyword, you're going to do well on the exam. There's a lot of them, and you'll be overwhelmed. When you first see the bill, oh my God, I've got to know that many things. You know most of it. But what you have to do when you look at a keyword is, what is this or who is this? Depends if it's a person or name, or I mean a name or a place or something or an event. What is it? Very simply, what is it? And the other half of the question is, why is it significant? Or why do I care? Or what does it have to do with the history we're studying? That sort of thing. And I do ID questions on the exam, and I ask you exactly that. I'll list maybe 5 keywords, and you got to tell me what it is and why it's important. And that'll be like 20% of your exam. It'll just be 5 questions. And normally, if I'm not too lazy, I'll send you a list of 10 potential keywords, and out of that 10, I will pick 5. I stopped letting students pick the 5 they liked because then I end up grading 10 different things. And when you've got 150 students or so, that starts driving you nuts about 2 o'clock in the morning. So I do it that way. Those are the kind of questions actually that tell me if you really know what we're talking about or not. In an ideal world, the whole test would be like that. I don't like essay questions because essay questions are just wasting a page of paper which is filled with fluff. For the main part, trying to prove to me that you know it when you don't. Keywords, I can look at that right there in 2 lines, maximum of 2 lines on an answer, maybe 1 line. I can tell right there, this guy knows the answer to the question. They understand it in terms of why it's important. Because when we're studying history, it's not a list of things that happened. You can get any timeline and do that. It's what caused it and what did it cause in return. It's understanding history. It's not just reciting history. Although I've had some teachers that taught it that way. Let's see if we can get into this thing now. And where did we leave off? We were talking about the wars of empire, I think. What's the last thing in your notes? Well, that's okay, but I could have said that any time. Anybody got any other event or anything in there?
The last thing I got was Charles II Granville of province of Carolina.
Okay, so we're still talking about the events in England. Okay, we got to really get moving here. If I can get this thing to work. What do you know? I know my own password. What we're talking about, and what we're going to talk about now too, is a series of wars. But the whole totality of what we were talking about, the things that were going on in England, the civil wars and all of that, and these wars that we're about to talk about, is 2 two ways they influence what's going on in the colonies. One, the benign neglect that you were talking about there. The whole idea is the colonies were left to steer their own course, so they developed in kind of a healthy way, no one holding them back. And then, of course, when Charles II gets back on the throne, he's going to start paying attention. We talked about Charles II and James, his brother. James II, we talked about him and the things he did to the colonies, such as combining all of New England into one giant mega colony, calling it the Dominion of New England. Do you have that in your notes? Okay. And of course, hopefully we talked about firing him and hiring his, and I'm using that term loosely, and hiring his daughter and her husband, William and Mary, to run England. And the effect it had on the colonies, because they were really confused. Who the heck are we supposed to be loyal to? Supposed to be loyal to James? We're supposed to be loyal to Parliament? We're supposed to be loyal to William and Mary? What's going on? And they were getting garbled news about the events. But that all kind of settles out. From Charles II to James II, even William and Mary, one thing you saw was eventually, one after the other, all the colonies started becoming royal colonies. So by the time of the first of the wars I'm going to talk about happened, William and Mary are firmly in control, and we cease having charter colonies and proprietary colonies, and they're all royal colonies. That's a whole lot of the importance of all the things that were going on in England. When we talk about the colonial wars, mainly all the colonial wars are about stuff that the Europeans are doing. They're not about us. But the thing is, we get some of the fallout. And what I want you to remember is the fallout. I don't care if Maria Theresa is the Empress of, or the Archduchess of Austria or any of that, except that's what started the war. And what started the first of these wars, and we'll call it King William's War. Let me get the slides up to kind of help you, but I'll try and not play with slides too much so that I'm still working on that external influences PowerPoint. Try and get down to the place we want to be in. The first war we're going to talk about, and I'll put it up for you guys in just a second, Mr. Director, so you don't have to point at me. As soon as I get it up there on here. Let's see if that's working. Wow, it actually works. Some gremlin didn't come in and pull wires out. The first war is called by historians, when you're talking about the whole world, is the War of the League of Augsburg. And the League of Augsburg was just an alliance of England, Spain, Sweden, Austria, not wanting France to get too big for their britches and expand and take other people's territory and be economically dominant all over the continent. That's what the English care about more. I mean, they didn't have any aspirations to control the continent, but it was all money. Some of the others are worried about territory. What we care about in this war, well, whenever you fight a war, whenever you see dogs fight, same difference. Think about it. Or in the playground, when it gets really bad. What do you always go for when you're going for the other person? Do you try and hit him where he's strong? No, you try and hit him at what you call a soft target. Sometimes that's physically soft, sometimes, I mean, even terrorists do that today. You always strike someone where you think you're going to be successful. And you're going to see a lot of that in these wars. The French, for example, in this war, we can call it King William's War or the War of the League of Augsburg, either one. He happens to be the king at the time when it starts. The French want to get at the English, and so they're going to try and plan an invasion of England and all that, but there's not much hope of carrying it off, but they're going to go after the English in America because those are places that aren't carefully protected. They won't even try and take on the American colonies exactly, but they're going to go for soft spots. They're going to go up to Hudson Bay and steal all the English fur trading outposts up in Hudson Bay, and they're going to excite the Indians. Why? Well, there's about in between 60 and 80,000 Frenchmen in the New World, and there's about 1.2 million or 1.3 million Englishmen in the New World, so if they don't use the Indians, they're vastly outnumbered. And they'll try and persuade the Indians to attack English settlements. What do? Right? It's just like when you're having a fist fight. You hit the guy in the gut to make him take his hands down, right? So you can poke him in the nose. That's exactly what they're doing to the English here. They're hitting them in the gut, hoping that it'll make them pull in their feelers. So they're going to get the Indians involved. That's going to upset the American colonists. They're also going to take away a place called Acadia from the French, and I'll show you a map of that in a minute. What happened during this period of time in America, 1689 to 1697? At least one person in this room has a book about it, about a certain event that's very famous. Let's get more specific, 1692. You've all heard of it. Say it. Say it really loud. Salem witch trials. Outstanding. Somebody in my class is awake. Salem witch trials. And a lot of times people blame this war for that. Why? Because the Indians are attacking a lot of the settlements up there. They feel vulnerable. It pushes a lot of pressure on them. And you and I know from COVID, that's a different kind of pressure. When people have a lot of pressure, you start seeing things fall apart a little bit. That's one of the theories about the Salem witch trials. When it's all over with, in 1697, I guess it just became too expensive for all parties involved. They're going to have a treaty, and everyone in the colonies is just going back to where they started. So there's absolutely no change. The French are going to give back those trading posts up in the Hudson. You know, go back. It's like a Monopoly game. When you get that card that says return to go, do not collect $200. That's exactly what this is. Except for the people who died or were wounded or maimed or whatever, there's no change. A few years down the line, by the way, some things happened during that war. One was Queen Mary II died of smallpox. In fact, her sister wanted to come to see her to say goodbye when she was dying, and Queen Mary was adamant that her sister not be allowed anywhere near her because she didn't want her sister to get smallpox. She understood, had an idea of how the disease spread. King William continues to function as the King of England, but people said from that point on, he becomes a very dour individual and less interested in what's going on in the world. Which gives you an indication that maybe that marriage was actually a marriage of affection, despite the fact it was a forced marriage. William's going to die in 1702, not long after that war ends. Queen Anne will be coronated. She'll take the throne, the baby sister of Mary, the first cousin of William, the last Stuart monarch. She'll be the last person in the Stuart family. She's got relatives, but now they all marry people from other families, so they're not Stuarts anymore. She had no children. We'll talk about that when we get there. The War of Spanish Succession, the next war. Some people called it Queen Anne's War because she was on the throne when it happened. It's all about the balance of power, but there's some other issues that get involved in the outcome. Here's the balance of power problem. If you're English, you don't want any other country to get too big. England's a little island. They're a force in the world because of their navy and their economy. So if anyone attacks their economy or threatens to overwhelm their navy, that threatens their existence. Kind of like Japan was, Second World War. It's hard to draw that comparison, but it's a good comparison. What happens is that the Habsburg family rules the Holy Roman Empire, and another branch, actually the senior branch, rules Spain. And King Charles II of Spain has no children, no close enough relatives in Spain. So he wills his throne and all of his possessions to one of his nephews, who's a member of the Bourbon family up in France. In fact, his name is Philip, and he's a direct heir to the throne of France. And England's looking at this, whoops, he becomes king of Spain this week, and next week the king of France dies, and he becomes king of France too. And we do not want a Spain-France. That's really out of control. And the people in Austria too, they thought one of their boys in the Habsburg family should still be king in Spain. So we're going to get this war, it's going to break out in 1702. They'll make a long story short, the British are going to win it again. The French side, of course, was Spain in this case. The outcome is what we really care about. But let's talk about American significance of the war itself. Up in New England, the French, a force of the Indians led by Frenchmen, is going to sack the town of Deerfield, Massachusetts, which runs a big scare through all those colonies. Down in the Chesapeake, somebody else is going to excite the local Indians, and they're going to attack settlements down there. It's called the Tuscarora War. And way down south, along the border with Spain, Spanish territory, there are going to be more attacks. Now, I kind of left something out when I was talking about that first war, the War of the League of Augsburg, but I mentioned it before when we were talking about things going on in England, and that was during that first war, the New England colonies, led by Massachusetts mainly, are going to get together and form that Confederation of New England, or the New England Confederation, as a defensive group to protect themselves against the Indian attacks, and at that time even against Dutch attacks. And they're still worried about that. This Indian thing worries all the colonists. The results, though, are even more interesting. There's two treaties signed to end it. We'll talk about one, and we'll forget about the other one. It's called the Treaty of Rastatt. Now erase that from your brains. It won't show up on an exam. But the Treaty of Utrecht, that's over in what is now Belgium. Let's look at some of the things that the Spanish got and other people got. Well, I don't have a summary of it here. The British rights to Hudson Bay, Newfoundland, Acadia, and the Iroquois are confirmed. After that first war, they gave Acadia back to the French. Now the French are going to have to accept that Acadia is gone forever. Did we talk about where the people from Acadia went when the British took over? Some of them stayed there. They didn't care. You know, they had their farm. They didn't care who's running it. Where'd the Acadians go? You all know this. It's in your consciousness, but it's buried and you don't know it. I'll spare you by not singing a song related to it. I used to do that. My children hated it. If I ever picked up a guitar and I strummed the first chords of that song, they'd all leave the house. Or say the word Acadia the way an Englishman would say it. If it was an Acadian, they don't say Acadian. They kind of slur it, and it comes out Acadian. IA comes out like that. Acadian. Who does that make you think of? What does that word make you think of? Cajuns. That's where they went. A lot of the refugees went down in the direction of Louisiana. And they're still there. If you don't believe it, drive off the main highway in Louisiana. Probably not a good idea, but you could. And you meet up with some really interesting folks, to say the least. That's one little thing that happened. Indian wars are not going to stop. The British will say, okay, Philip, you can be king of Spain. We won't kick you off the throne. Philip V, But you have to renounce, according to the Treaty of Utrecht, he had to renounce his claims to the French throne. So they agreed to that. The Austrians got some territory. They wanted their man on the Spanish throne. They don't get it. They're going to get territory over in the Netherlands. They're going to get territory in Italy that the Spanish were dominating. So the French power in Europe is going to be reduced somewhat as a result of this. But the big thing, I haven't mentioned yet, the asiento. The asiento, that's just, anybody speak good Spanish? No? More or less, it's the acceptance, and in this case, it's the acceptance of the British having the right to sell slaves in Latin American colonies. Remember, the Spanish and the English both had closed systems of trade. So the Spanish weren't allowed to stick their nose in the English system, and the English weren't allowed to stick their nose in the Spanish system. And according to this asiento, they now have the right to go into Spanish colonies to sell slaves. That was the only right they got. Spanish were really unhappy about this, but there wasn't much they could do about it because they lost the war. They got some other territory. The French are going to hang on to some of their territories up there. They'll get some of the islands, like the island that we call Prince Edward Island now. They kept that. They kept the fortress of Louisbourg, which was on that island. But the British get this right to deal in slaves. They are going to make so much money on the slave trade. They dwarf everyone else in the slave trade. Bringing slaves from Africa to the Americas. Most of them didn't come to North America, by the way. Most of them went to South America to be sold to the Brazilians for their sugar plantations, or to the Caribbean to be sold to the Dutch and the Spanish for their sugar plantations, and bringing these slaves back to England. You'll figure, right? They made, I don't know what you compare it to, billions, maybe trillions of dollars on this. They built the city of Bristol into a major city. They built the city of Liverpool, the Beatles' hometown, into a major city, all from slave trade. All from slave trade. So that was a big deal. And of course, because of the economy, the effect on their economy, it's going to bring them higher and higher in comparison to other European countries, which is what they're looking at mainly. I just had to put this up here. I actually had a person in one of my classes that's been there. One of the things that the British won in this war was a little itty-bitty island that you can't find on most maps called St. Kitts. There it is. Got that memorized. Moving on. There's Acadia. French are going to lose this permanently. There's other places that the French and Spanish will lose that we haven't even mentioned. I'll mention one in the future. By the way, when Queen Anne died, somewhere along the line back here, or is it on the slides? It's just a statement. That's what I get for jumping back and forth. Where'd it go? I know Queen Anne died somewhere in here. At any rate, she dies. Now, they've got a problem in England. And I mentioned this when we were talking about the family. She doesn't have any cousins named Stuart except for Catholics. I mean, the closest relative that she has when she died, where's George? There you go. The closest cousins she had were at first her father, and then her father's son, her half-brother, James Francis Edward Stuart, and his son, Charles Edward Louis John Casimir Sylvester Severino Maria Stuart. Got that memorized? Maybe I should put that in the ID question. Anyway, they both claim that they're the rightful heirs of the throne of England. The King of France, who's their first cousin or first cousin once removed, Louis XIV, backs that claim, and so does the Pope. But of course, the English don't give a hoot what any of those people say. But from time to time, both James Francis Stuart and Charles Stuart will come back to England and try and regain the throne, start little wars. While these big world level wars are going on, there's a little war. They call them the Jacobite Wars. Jacob comes from a Latin version of James. They'll never get the job done, and finally the French king's going to have to stop backing them because it's throwing money away, among other things. But now we've got George on the throne. He can't even speak English. Oh, how did he get there? Well, they went down 32 names before they found a Protestant descended from the same people that Anne was descended from. It was her second cousin, I think, named Sophia. But Sophia died, so they took Sophia's son George. He's also the Elector of Hanover, which means he's the Prince of Hanover. Elector means he gets to vote for the Holy Roman Emperor. Can't speak a word of English, but here he comes over to England and sits on the throne of England. Of course, he's not going to really interfere on how the country's run. The Parliament will do it all. When he dies, his son George II will take over. And we're getting to about that point. George is named after him. He's the one that commissions that colony. We're coming to another war. The War of Austrian Succession. This is a different problem. This is a problem of gender. Well, that's the excuse for the war. The problem was different people wanted their candidate to be the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. But the Holy Roman Emperor was a guy named Charles VI. That's confusing because there's a Charles II that was the last Spanish king. Charles VI doesn't have any male heirs, so he passes a rule that stipulates that his daughter can become the Queen of Hungary, the Queen of Bohemia, and the Archduchess of Austria. Austria being one of the most powerful of the European countries at the time. The French had their candidate, other people in the Habsburg family had other candidates. War is going to break out over this. And in this particular case, I don't want to leave out good stuff. The British are going to still be aligned with Austria. They're going to try and take up her cause and help her out. Why are the British even involved in Austria and all that silliness? Because the kings of England, the Georges, are all also princes over in Hanover. And they want to protect their old homeland. And they think that Austria can protect their homeland for them, so they're allied with the Austrians. That won't last forever. And the British, once again, they do what the French did. They're looking for soft targets. Now they're going to send their army over in the vicinity of Austria to help them. And the king will lead them. This will be the last time in British history that a king ever led an army in the field. So their army is pretty much fully occupied. Their navy has nothing to do because they can't get to the middle of Austria. So they're going to come over and attempt to hit the Spanish, the allies of the French, in a way that causes them to drop their arms, if you want. They're going to try and cut off their pocketbook. But instead of going straight to Spanish possessions, they're going to sail straight to the American colonies. Why? They didn't have any soldiers. And you'd never guess where they're going to start recruiting soldiers. They're going to draft them. They're not going to ask them to volunteer. They're going to say, get on the ship, we need you. They're going to pick up American colonists. And the American colonists are very, very resentful. They're still British subjects. Most of them feel they still have to follow orders. They're resentful because of that Indian issue never went away after the First War started. And it got worse in the Second War. Now we're in this third war, War of Austrian Succession, otherwise known as King George's War. And the British Navy is going to come over and say, you, and you, we need you for military service down in South America, and they load them up and take them away, leaving no one at home to protect their families from the Indians. So they're super resentful and very apprehensive. They go down to a place called Portobello. It's on the Isthmus of Panama, kind of down in the general area of where the Panama Canal is now. Of course, there was no canal then. But that's a major crossing point for Spanish gold and other things. They take Portobello and burn it to the ground, but they can't occupy it because they don't have people to leave behind. Besides that, it's yellow fever territory, and the British soldiers can't stand it. They go over to a place that's now Venezuela, to a seaport called Cartagena, which is a major transshipment point as well. They're not able to take Cartagena. That's to totally cut the Spanish off from getting gold and silver out. They're not able to take it though. Well, take a look at it. You can't just capture a place like that with a pop gun or even ships or whatever. It would take a really major force. And a bunch of the British soldiers and the Americans and all of that start catching yellow fever from just being around there. So they finally give up. So they failed to take away the breadbasket, or not the breadbasket, the money source for the Spanish. But one man does the job for them. His name is George Anson. He's a Navy captain, British Navy captain. And he's given 2 ships. And he's told, go do it, George. This man circumnavigates the globe, sneaks up on the Manila galleon, which is carrying all sorts of precious things worth about 1/2 of the entire national income of Spain, and he grabs that galleon and takes it back to England. So he's achieved what that big fleet led by Edward Vernon couldn't do. That's going to help bring King George's War to an end, because the Spanish are broke, and the French are getting that way. So they're going to yell uncle. Outcome, as far as we're concerned, well, some different kinds of outcomes. The Spanish were unhappy about the Asiento. They're still unhappy. They had a little war with the English that started before the main war started. And it will just come together. It's called the War of Jenkins' Ear. It's about a ship's captain that got his ear cut off by a Spanish tax collector who wanted to inspect his ship. And it becomes a big thing, and the English want to go to war with, or the English Parliament wants to go to war with Spain. But it all melds together in this King George's War, or War of Austrian Succession. American colonists go up and capture that French fort at Louisbourg on St. Breton Island. The French grabbed an English colony in India called Madras. There's a lot of territory that's captured this side and that. One of the things that Britain walks away with, they now own Gibraltar, which is at the tip end of Spain. It's kind of the gateway to the Mediterranean. The Asiento is confirmed. You can't get rid of the Asiento no matter how hard you fight. Maria Theresa does get on the throne of Austria and Bohemia, but she doesn't get to be Holy Roman Emperor. They really don't settle most of the issues. Some people exchange territory, that sort of thing. But the British swapped Louisbourg that the colonists just captured for them for Madras, to get Madras and India back. That really frosts the colonists. And another thing that bothers the colonists is when they fought down in South America and Central America, they were under the command of British officers, and they thought the British officers were unbelievably arrogant. And the American colonial militia, who had ranks, the British just totally disregarded their ranks. So they had colonels and captains and majors and all that, and the British would let, one of their captains give all of those guys orders. The Americans resented that. They resented the fact that they'd been dragged away from their homes. And the British were very resentful because they said, you're a British subject, you owe us service. And they thought the Americans were kind of like, controlling the Americans is like herding cats. So both sides had some justification in not liking the other side. But that's the whole point. It's both sides. There start to be sides in this. And the British are looking at these British colonists, Englishmen, one and all, well, most of them, and they're saying, they're not real Englishmen. And they start calling them these colonials, or even worse, these Americans. And on the other side, the Americans are recognizing we're a lot different from those English soldiers. Even though we're Englishmen, well, one thing, most of the Americans were bigger. Why? Because Americans ate more. They had better food. They lived better. They had a land rich with resources. British soldiers weren't paid well, and most of them came from a class of people that didn't live well. So you're seeing this kind of development of two separate identities. Where before everybody was an Englishman, everybody was in the same boat. That map is just to show where the English army was and why it couldn't go to South America, why the Americans had to go. After this is over, there's hard feelings all around because no one got what they wanted out of the war. The Austrians are mad because the English, who were their allies and helped them out during the war, forced them to give up territory at the end of the war just so they could have peace. And the Austrians started thinking, well, if the English are our friends and they're going to treat us that way, why not just have our next door neighbors be our friends and we don't have to fight them? And so they kissed and made up with the French. The British, however, who were motivated by wanting to protect King George's Hanover, were looking at a very dynamic leader of the Prussians, who were the enemies of the Austrians, thinking, those guys have a future, and they're going to be the big power over around Hanover, and they switched and started supporting the Prussians. So you have a total realignment in Europe, and you have the development of separate identities in the American colonies. Those are the big effects of that war. In most of these later wars, every time they get the Spanish to fight on their side and all that, the French always promise them, we're going to give you Gibraltar back when the war's over. And they're never able to do it. Now we're coming up to another war. It's called the 7 Years' War in Europe. Our part of it is called the French and Indian War. This is almost a world war. It involves fighting on 5 different continents: Europe, the Americas, West Africa, India, the Philippines. The Philippines qualify as a continent not because they're a continent in and of themselves, but they're part of a region that we call insular Southeast Asia. The conflict splits Europe right down the middle. Britain and Prussia now are allies. Portugal has always been Britain's ally because they're intermarried. Some small German-speaking states. France, Austria, the Russian Empire, Spain, Sweden are all going to be on the other side. There's also fighting in India between the French and the English. And of course, as usual, French are on one side of this fight and the English are on the other side. In America, the war actually starts a year or so more earlier than the Europeans considered the war to have been going on. There's no declared war. And it's all about, in about 1749, while other things are going on, the King of France tells his people in New France, their American colonies, you can have the Ohio River Basin. When you talk about a river basin, it's the territory in which all the water flows into that river. At the same time, or a little bit later, the King of England tells the American colonies, you can have the Ohio River Basin. The ones from the direction of Canada, although Canada didn't really exist yet, they go due south to get there. The ones from the American colonies go due west to get there. Things work out. After each side claims it, the French are going to build in 1750 a line of forts. They go all the way down from the Great Lakes, from Lake Erie, all the way down to a place called Fort Duquesne. That's named after their governor, the governor of New France. They go down to the forks of the Allegheny and the Monongahela, where they meet together and they form the Ohio River. What's there? You guys all should know this when you study geography in about the 5th grade. Okay, I'll give you a hint. See if somebody can come up with an answer quick. It's 3 rivers coming together. 3 rivers. What do you know that's 3 rivers? Anybody know anything about football teams? Who plays at Three Rivers Stadium? Oh my goodness gracious. Steelers. So what's there? What city will be there? Pittsburgh. It's not there yet. But they have this little Fort Duquesne, right where those 2 rivers meet. Now, Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia doesn't know this, but he's heard reports that there's some French people nosing around in his Ohio River Basin. So he sends a young surveyor by the name of George Washington, some militiamen, and some of their Indian allies up there to look around to see if there's any French people there and to disabuse them of the notion that they're allowed to be there. Only when he gets there, and I'm making a really long story short, when he gets there, he discovers this French fort, which has got a hell of a lot more people than he has in his little group. So apparently he's not going to tell them anything. And he sneaks back across the Monongahela River, headed for home, and one of his scouts spots a small French patrol, and they decide to ambush the patrol, and they capture some Frenchmen, some Indians, they kill some too. And then a strange, quirky thing in history happens. The evening after the battle, while George Washington, I suppose, was asleep, the Indians that were in his force took this young French officer, who appeared to be a brave young man, and in the custom of their tribe and some of the local tribes there, they cut out his beating heart, and I think ate it. Can't guarantee that I wasn't there, even though some people think I was. This is going to cause George Washington some problems. And some people escaped from that ambush to start with, and they're back at Fort Duquesne telling the French there that we were ambushed and some of our people were murdered brutally. And so the French send a fairly large force out, much larger than George Washington's force. He tries to get his little force organized so they can resist an attack, but it's rainy and nobody wants to dig holes to hide in or anything, so they're not really ready. And the French surround them with a major force. There's no way Washington can fight them. His gunpowder is wet, nothing's working. So the French commander sends a note to him, says, if you'll just cease hostilities, we don't need to kill anyone else. You guys can take your guns and vacate this area and don't come back, and we'll let you go. Oh, and sign this little document. And they gave him a document that looked like a document of surrender, and he signed it. He couldn't read French. The document admitted that he had committed war crimes and murdered this French lieutenant. He didn't know it until much later. It comes to his attention. Kind of a spot on his honor. But he goes back to Governor Dinwiddie and he says, there's no way I can hold off against these people. And Dinwiddie understands that. The British governor at the time, the Governor General of all the colonies, and also the Commander-in-Chief of all British troops in North America, was a fellow named Edward Braddock. and he says, well, you want something done, you do it yourself. So he saddles up the troops he has available, takes some more militiamen, brings along George Washington as a guide, and says, we're going back to take Fort Duquesne. He doesn't do what George Washington says about deploying his troops or anything. George Washington keeps saying, there's bad guys in the woods. They get ambushed, about half of their force is killed. The rest of them, a lot of colonists, just scattered. They knew how to fight in the woods. General Braddock is mortally wounded and dies the following day. They dig a hole in the ground. It's actually in the middle of the road. They bury him in this hole in the middle of the road and then walk over it so nobody can tell there's a grave there because they don't want the enemy to dig him up. Then they skedaddle back for Virginia again. It's going to take the British a while to react to all of this. Let's see if I've got a map. There's George Washington's part of it. His battle was at Great Meadow, which would have put it in just inside the Pennsylvania line. He's going to cross back and head back into Virginia and go back to Alexandria, which is across probably the largest city there at the time, and tell people we were whipped. General Braddock's dead. Now the British have to figure out a replacement. The first guy they pick is a British officer who is their Commissioner for Indian Affairs in North America, named Sir William Johnson. He's not a for real general. Doesn't mean he doesn't know how to do it. And eventually they're going to replace him with a British regular general. He's not going to do well. Then they're going to replace that general with another one. He's not going to do well. And finally they're going to settle on a guy by the name of Jeffrey Amherst. I'll show you a picture of him somewhere along the line here. And Amherst is going to reorganize. See if I can find a map of it. There it is, all you ever needed to know about the French and Indian War. At first, before Amherst becomes the commander, the British are going to try and go back to Duquesne, get their butts whipped again. They're going to try and go up to dislodge the French from up north of Albany, New York. They're going to get their butts whipped there. They're going to try and set up an outpost along Lake Ontario. They're going to get whipped there. They're going to try and fight again at the other end of Lake Ontario. They're going to get whipped there over and over again. Eventually, Amherst is going to get things under control. About the end of 1758, he's going to split his major forces. In 1758, the one guy, Sir William Johnson, remember the guy that used to be the overall commander and got kind of fired? He's going to take his Iroquois and militia unit, and he's going to go up and capture a French fort called Fort Niagara. He's already won another fight, and he's kind of a hero. They make him give him a baronetcy, which is the lowest in the line of aristocracy. But he's still just in charge of that one group. Then Amherst is going to withdraw to Halifax, marshal his troops. He's going to get reinforcements from England. He's going to go up and take Louisburg away, or Louisburg if you're a Frenchman, away from the French. Then he's going to split his forces. He's going to send a young general by the name of Wolfe up to the mouth of the St. Lawrence and tell him, work your way up the St. Lawrence all the way to Quebec, capture to Quebec, and keep on going. He himself will take command of forces that get onto the Great Lakes at Lake Ontario. He's going to win a number of victories along the edge of Lake Ontario, making up for their losses before. He's going to get onto the St. Lawrence River upstream from Montreal. I actually don't think they called it Montreal back then. I think it had a different name. But anyway, these two forces eventually are going to meet. That's the plan. James Wolfe is going to take Quebec. And that was a tough nut to crack because Quebec's way up on cliffs. And if you tried to use the strength of the British Navy, it didn't work very well because their cannons wouldn't shoot uphill like that. So he's going to figure out a way to bring cannons off the ships up into the plains of Abraham that face the fortified city of Quebec. He's going to more or less dare General Montcalm to come out and fight. I don't think he sent him a message and dared him, but his appearance there upsets Montcalm, and Montcalm wants to drive them off the cliffs. So Montcalm comes out of the gates, which is a big mistake, and they have a massive battle there, and both generals are killed in this battle. They were both pretty brave leaders. General Wolfe will die in the battlefield, General Montcalm will be killed, but the British get Quebec. And then General Wolfe's force, even though Wolfe's dead, they're going to keep moving up the St. Lawrence River, and eventually they're going to meet up with Amherst. They're going to basically besiege Montreal. And a year after Quebec fell in September of 1759. A year later, Montreal is going to fall in September of 1760. And for all intents and purposes, and for American purposes, that was more or less the end of the French and Indian War. The French have no more forces to fight with. But the 7 Years' War isn't over. There's fighting in Europe. And what else hasn't turned off, because it doesn't automatically turn off every time the French turn them on? What is their big weapon in America? Come on, guys. Thinking time. What's the only big weapon the French have in America? And ever since the first war, they've been using it. What? The Indians. And they're not like a machine. They don't turn on and then turn off. And so even though the French had surrendered in the Americas, the Indians hadn't. And the Indians are going to become really, really angry because the Great White Father that promised them all sorts of wonderful things after they finished defeating the English got on his boats and sailed away and left them there holding the bag. That's going to be a problem. And the British slowly will occupy all the French outposts out in the western part of the colony. That'll also make the Indians angry. Plus the fact that this General Amherst was a dirty fighter. Even his own Indian allies, he wouldn't give them ammunition. And he used germ warfare. One of his colonels actually proposed to him that they get blankets that are infected with smallpox and give them to the Indians to eradicate the Indians. And it didn't wipe out all the Indians, but it did wipe out a village or so. Sir William Johnson flipped out, was writing nasty grams over to England, saying, "Get rid of this madman." Amherst thought he was a big hero because he'd won the French and Indian War. And he did. He did a pretty good job at it. Eventually, he's going to lose out. There's Wolfe, there's Montcalm, both killed on the Plains of Abraham in front of Quebec. While all this is going on, and you don't need to remember any of this, I just want you to see. The British lose the island of Minorca. That's over in the Balearic Islands on the east side of the Iberian Peninsula. The Austrians are no longer their friends. They're going to send their navy to attack French settlements in West Africa and also in the West Indies. They're also going to be fighting in India. They're going to notice that the French are trying to put together an invasion fleet so they can invade England. So they're going to sail over to Le Havre and wipe out that fleet. Lots of other battles, naval battles. A big British attack in India, grabbing French territory such as Pondicherry, the capital of the French part of India. They're going to get the island of Guadeloupe. I'm not sure what that was worth unless they were already planning for students to spend their spring vacations there. The Spanish also invaded Portugal, and they were a longtime ally of the English. And the English are going to drive them out. And it's interesting to note the English general that did this work was a guy by the name of John Burgoyne, and we're going to see him again. The Spanish, to get out of the war, tells the English, we want to end our hostilities, and to sweeten the deal, they gave them Florida. They couldn't hold on to Florida anyway, so why not? So they gave Florida to the English. By the way, they're going to take it back. But the big problem in 1763, okay, the war was more or less over in 1760 for the American side. The treaty won't end the war in Europe until 1763. And about the same time, the leader of a group of Indians called the Ottawa is really resentful because off in the distance he can see British manning what used to be a French trading post where they used to be able to get a lot of goodies and things like that. And he gets angry about it, and they wipe him out. They overwhelm that trading post and kill everybody. They call this Pontiac's War because that was the chief that did that. He wasn't in control of the other Indian tribes, but when they saw that he had the temerity to go wipe out that outpost, other tribes, the Abjuas, the Menominee, the Miamis, all these others, the Wyandots, they all start going after outposts that are within their tribal areas. And the British were about to get back on the ship to go back to England, right? All the fighting's over with. The French are conquered. The French agreed in the Treaty of Paris in 1763, we will withdraw from North America, period. So General Amherst figures, well, the war's over. Starts loading up troops to go back home. When this Indian stuff breaks out, they're going to make a U-turn, send 7 regiments out there to subdue the Indians. This is about the time when he's figuring to use germ warfare against them. He's getting some bad press in England that he doesn't know about. Not bad press, but bad people writing letters to certain political leaders. Eventually Amherst, who cannot lower himself to negotiate with the Indians or anything of that nature, and won't follow the advice of their Indian agent, Sir William Johnson, eventually, it's towards the end of 63, it's getting worse and worse instead of better and better. He's called back to England. He thinks he's going back to get a reward for winning the French and Indian War and all of that. And believe it or not, he actually does get promoted, but they take the job away from him. And they put another general in charge, and that general will stop hostilities and get to negotiating with the Indians and bring peace as a result of that. His name is Thomas Gage. William Johnson's probably the guy that got Amherst fired by writing letters back home. Amherst out, Gage in. We'll know a lot about Thomas Gage before long. Some of the results of all 4 of these wars. America's developing independently. Nobody's interfering with that. The Native Americans, because of the English and the French fighting, the Native Americans are really angry, and they're also worried about colonial expansion. If you were an American Indian, somebody out here answer this question. If you're an American Indian and you've got to choose between supporting the English or supporting the colonials, who would you support? Try that. Make a logical answer and then tell me your logic. Who would you support?
The colonial.
The colonials. Everybody else agree with that? Why not?
I feel like most Indians are thinking, or they attack the colonialists because they think they're like invading their land, so maybe they'll probably support the...
I don't know if you guys could hear that out there because he was speaking very softly. But, yeah, and you didn't press the button. Well, sometimes you can pick it up on my mic too. But the answer given, I would support the British, and you've kind of got the right thing. The British, the Indians know, are going to go home someday. But the colonists aren't. So if they don't wipe out, they take the chance to wipe out the colonists, just like old Opequano in Virginia, they're never going to get rid of them. And boy, was that right. So a lot of the Indians later on, when we get to another event, they're going to tend to support the British. Not all of them. So you get that. You get this perpetual problem with the Indians, and the colonists aren't helping their own cause in that respect. You also get 2 attempts during this period of time, counting the British Civil Wars and these 4 wars of empire, where the colonists tried to get together and form a group that could defend them. Way back in the 1600s, it was the New England Confederation, which lasted for a while, then fell apart. Then there's going to be something called the Albany Convention. In fact, when General Braddock was still alive, He needed a lot of support for the colonies, because they made him pay for some of it, and feed the British troops and things like that. But he needed the colonies to contribute more fighters and that sort of thing. So he told the colonies, before he went after Fort Duquesne and got himself killed, he told them, get together and work it out. Who's going to contribute what, et cetera, et cetera. And they did that. And it was called the Albany Convention. There it is on the slides. Connecticut, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Virginia figured they'd already done their part. Georgia was too far away. The Carolinas were pretty far away. But they're going to meet up in Albany, New York. They're going to set up a plan where they'll set up this kind of a confederation. It's a defensive thing. They'll have what they call a governor-president or something like that. They're not sure what. They've never done anything like this before. But they work it out in a lot of detail. Then they take this plan. By the way, Benjamin Franklin was probably responsible for writing most of it, called the Albany Plan of Union. You need to put stars under that and lines under it and all of that. And the Albany Convention as far as that goes. So they take this, when they finally figure out what form this grouping is going to take, they send messengers with copies of this to all of the colonies to get their approval, and also over to the king. I mean, this is not independence or anything. In fact, they're going to ask the king to appoint their president general or whatever they're going to call the guy. So tell me, who gave the thumbs down to this organization? Who do you think? And why? Here's another one of those tricky questions. Somebody out in Plainview, give it a shot. Who do you think would support this getting together of some colonies, or who would be against it? Who would be against this amalgamation of colonies? The king? Surprisingly, the people that turned it down were the colonies themselves. Why? Because none of those colonies wanted to give up its independence from the other colonies. They didn't want some group to be able to force them to do things they didn't want to do. So even though their own representatives wrote all of this stuff, they're going to turn it down. The Crown didn't even have a chance to support it or oppose it. And I really don't think they cared one way or the other. There's that map of the whole French and Indian War that we don't need to look at. Okay. So those are some of the results of all these wars and of the British civil unrest. Do I have anything else? No, I don't. Let's look at another slide. I'm going to start using a slide you've got in your Unit 4 lectures. If I find it. We'll call it, it's the one called American Revolution Prelude. It's got the word ultra after it. I think it's in Unit 4 lectures. See it in there? It says something about the American Revolution. The written one is Prelude to the American Revolution, but the other one, the PowerPoint, is American Revolution - Prelude, I think. See it? Find it? Got it? Okay. I'll turn it on. At any rate, I go back, oh, somebody's already written on this. I go back, you know, the students that watch my lectures on Ultra, you can write on stuff that's on the screen. Every once in a while, one of them will get wise and put mustaches on my guys and stuff like that. That's all right, that proves he's awake. There's old Jeffrey Marshall, or Jeffrey Amherst rather, who's going to get fired. And he was relieved of command because they thought in England that he caused Pontiac's rebellion. There is evidence that he actually approved using smallpox. There's letters between him and his colonel. So Thomas Gage is going to take over. He's the one that's going to end that French and Indian War. Okay, there's some nasty, I'm going to put it up so you guys can see it out there. There's some nasty footnotes to the French and Indian War. And one of them, and I want you to remember this, is the Paxton Boys. These guys used to be members of the Paxton Rangers, and during the French and Indian War, these guys, they're kind of like special forces or something. They go out in the middle of nowhere and fight kind of a guerrilla war against the Indians. So, through the progress of the war, they learned to hate Indians. And they weren't really particular about what Indians it was. At the end of the war, these guys are from Pennsylvania. Remember, that was a very tolerant colony, and everybody got along with everybody else and all that. Well, these guys are changing that. Most of them are Scots-Irish veterans. They're going to find an Indian village. They make up their minds they're going to drive all Indians out of Pennsylvania, totally. And there's a village of Conestoga Indians. They're peaceful people. They're members of the community. They blend in with the other people in the community. But they're going to go to where their little village is, and they're going to attack them with the idea of wiping them out. But authorities get there in time and stop it. Quite a few people have already been killed. The Paxton Boys are going to vanish into the woods. They've had practice doing that. Now the colonial authorities have to figure out how to protect the Indians until they can round up the Paxton Boys. So they put them in a big jail, protective custody. And the Paxton Boys sneak up on that jail, break in, and finish the job. It's a brutal killing of men, women, children. I don't think there were very many survivors. There's an eyewitness account, which I'm not going to take the time to read. It's pretty ugly. The Paxton Boys also threatened to invade Philadelphia. Benjamin Franklin stops them. Everyone in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania respected him. And he actually stands out in the road and says, "You boys better think this over again, because a whole lot of people are coming after you. Probably a good idea to fade away into the woods again." And he broke up the crowd. But still, it shows you this growing enmity between the white settlers and Indians. Okay, we are now developing into the American Revolution. And this is the first stage of the American Revolution. And it actually happened before the War of Spanish Succession, before King George's War, before the 7 Years' War. But it's a process, it's not an event. The Great Awakening was the realization by people in England and other places, mainly Protestants, that they weren't reaching the people. You were starting to get to where church was kind of a habit. You went to church, the guy read something from, up behind the pulpit, read something out, waved his hands at you, and it was over with. Kind of like some lectures you get when you're in college. And smart younger people started thinking, we're not reaching anybody. They're just coming in here because they're used to coming in here. So what do? We have to reach the common man. And both in America, and it almost develops at the same time, and in England, even in the Church of England, which was the formal church, you're going to start seeing ministers who try and reach the people. And this means that they're going to have to be good speakers. They're going to have some gimmick to get everyone's attention. You're going to have to wake up those sleeping people out in the congregation. Kind of like my struggles from day to day teaching this class. And some of them figure it out. One of them is a guy named Jonathan Edwards up in Massachusetts. One of his most famous sermons was "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." And I love doing this, so get ready to plug your ears up. Anybody ever seen Pollyanna? It's a Walt Disney movie. It's a little girl that just sees good things about everything. And then she turns crabby because she has an accident and she's paralyzed. And her aunt is a rich lady who pays the salary of the minister. in their village, and she says, you got to spice up these sermons. Everyone's sleeping in your sermons. What are you going to do about it? Give your sermons some oomph. And they show you the church, and all the little kids are playing with frogs and stuff in the middle of the service, and young men and young women are spending more time holding hands and looking at each other, not paying attention to the sermon, and some of the older people are sleeping, and you see this guy walk in. He's kind of pulling himself together. It's played by Carl Malden. He does a really good job. He puts his hand up on the pulpit, and he leans over towards his congregation and looks at them quietly for a minute, and then all of a sudden goes, "Death comes unexpectedly. Change your ways or roast in hell." And everyone's going, "Whoa, what was that?" Everybody awake? I love that. Sometimes the teachers from the rooms next door come by and complain. That's what they did. And the thing was, that was dynamic, and it attracted attention, and more people came to see them, and before long there wasn't room in the church, so they started doing church outdoors. There was an Englishman, Church of England. He was doing kind of the same thing, maybe not quite as forcefully as Jonathan Edwards. His name was George Whitefield. He becomes really popular in the Church of England over in England, and then he's invited to come over to Savannah, Georgia, and speak. Because some of the preachers think we need something to get things going here. And he does. He even preaches to the slaves, which was unheard of in those days. He starts a tour. He goes back to England. They say, "Hey, that was good. Come back." He's going to start a tour that starts from Georgia, works its way all the way up through Pennsylvania into New England. It's like a rock star. I mean, thinking about it, Benjamin Franklin, our leading kind of intellectual light, he was a deist. A lot of our big leaders were deists. What does that mean? They believe in God, but they believed God